nation where we are busy putting death out of business. Death is going out of the queue to the unemployment line, to the back of the line. And we're going to talk again, another panel about atheism 2020. It's the year of the atheist, I think. This is a big year for atheism, and it's a big year for secularism. There's many global problems, and they require secular solutions. All right, so we have an interesting panel lined up for this discussion on atheism and secularism. It's Chase, Holling, and Zion. Welcome all to Detonation. Thank you so much for appearing. We value your input greatly on this topic. Chase, opening up on you, Mr. Chase, would you just like to introduce yourself and tell the audience who you are and why you're passionate about secularism?
Oh, yeah, I'm 56 years old, living in Phoenix, Arizona, USA. I mean, religion has fucked up the world enough. Time to let secularism take over.
Fantastic. That's fighting words there from Mr. Chase. Mr. Holling, how are you? Welcome to Detonation. Do you have such strong fighting words?
Doing well, thanks. No, not so much fighting words, but I agree. I don't disagree by any means. I've been an atheist for a little over 10 years now, I guess. Was sort of agnostic before that, but yeah, and the reason for it is just because it makes sense. I mean, there's nothing else that makes any sense, but the secular view, in my opinion, anyway. So that's where I am on it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your introductory remarks. Ben Zion, welcome back to the panel. We just came off a panel full of some very amazing topics on hereditary religion and the secularization of society and, you know, the pushbacks by religious communities against some of this. How are you, and what do you say as your opening remarks on this panel?
Well, I'm glad that we're going to have an opportunity to talk at a little more length about this important issue in this concern about indoctrination of young people, which is how these educational institutions would deal with this. And in my view, the answer is that there should be an equally high wall between church and state in these institutions as in any other institutions. And perhaps we should have even greater sensitivities there for seeing these young minds are protected, because we know there is a receptive window for young people where they might be more easily tricked before they reach an age of mental maturity. They might tend to be manipulated even without the full realization of those doing the manipulating. And this is true as well in religious education. The ways in which certain countries are theocracies, even these United States. We talked about the Project Blitz at some length in the last talk, and other ways in which the United States is not a fully secular society, and that is even to reflect public policy. That is a concerning set of circumstances, and thinking about education is important in preventing these bad outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks to all the viewers who are joining us to watch Detonation for this decade. We appreciate all your company. Thank you very much. All right, so Chase, so you said religion has messed up the world a lot. Could you expand on this point? What has religion actually done that's harmed the global community? What's some examples?
War, genocide, persecution of minorities. I'm like, mistreatment of women.
Yep.
Marginalization of anybody who doesn't quite fit in.
Yeah. These are all horrible ideas. And how do you think that these germinate in religion? Do you think it's inherently to do with religion, or is it to do with religious practices, or the institutions, or the power mechanisms? What is it about religion that enables some of these tragedies?
Now, religion legitimizes people who are already inclined to be douchebags.
All right, thank you. What do you say, Mr. Holling? What do you say? Obviously he's brought up some really good examples of horrendous crimes against humanity. Do you agree? Do you think what is the mechanism that enables religious people to carry on?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And religion, the purpose of religion is for control. People think that that it was, that it's for a lot of different things, and it's maybe started out as one thing, but very quickly became a tool for controlling the populace, and that's really what its primary objective is. And so, and sometimes that control has been by violent means. Sometimes it's been by manipulation. It's had a lot of different approaches to controlling the populace, but it's never been a positive thing. And people say, well, religion has a lot of positive aspects, and I don't disagree with that. I think there are it gives some people some comfort, and I can see the positive pieces of it, but as a whole, that comfort can be gotten by things that are real, things that are proven, and internally as well. Without looking to some organization that's really there to control you and get as much of your money as they can, for the most part.
From a religious perspective, if you're talking about the immortality of the soul, you're talking about eternal hellfire. I mean, eternal is a long time. Wouldn't any horrendous act being given in the name of religion, anything that you could do in this life, be a temporary phenomena compared to if you didn't act on your belief? What do you say to that? Or do you think it would be immoral for religious people not to have an inquisition?
Well, sure. That's one of my primary reasons for not being religious. I just don't believe it. Okay, so that's the primary reason, obviously. But what I've always said is that if there was a God, and it is the God as described in any of the in the Bible or any of those texts, I really don't want anything to do with them, because it's just not. Any of us on our own can come up with a moral framework that's far superior to anything you'd find in any religious text.
Thank you, Benzine. Opening comments on religion. Why do you think? What do you think about the atrocities that some religions have perpetuated? And what do you think the core? Is it a power? What's the core of modus operandi of these? These
power, resources.
It doesn't have to. I mean, you don't need a roadmap to know that these religious institutions dramatically predate the modern nation state of the last 100 years. But they were nationalist entities to some degree, proto-nationalist entities, and why does that bear mentioning? It's precisely what Mr. Holling said a few moments ago. These things were used to get a large number of people in a certain kind of compliance and orientation, and so there's no looking at the history of Christianity or Islam without seeing that it has this imperialist inclination, and that kind of geopolitical entity, it becomes that in a fairly violent and cruel way, and this is something that does continue in some strains in these, even in other parts of the world outside of North America, where Christianity, for example, is more rightly described as a sort of tendency to be post-Christian, folks who are mostly religious moderates or people not engaging in the kind of fundamentalism that exists in larger numbers here in the United States. There's still concerns there. There's still ways in which Benelux countries and other countries in Europe, for example, are seeing a resurgence in religiosity and in certain peculiar legal kind of manifestations. Now, the Netherlands has laws on the books that prevent something that we've done shows on, cryonics, and it seems to reflect some kind of religious law that's still on the books. It has no relevance to anyone's lives. You might not say that and something preventing cryonics is any great tragedy. I'm inclined to think that it is a little bit of a loss, but the point is that any civil society can probably point to some concerns of this kind, and we hope that in the course of the 21st century, these concerns will continue to become less and less prevalent, as they seem to be. You know, we mentioned in the last show that there are 25% fewer religious people in the United States than there were just as many years ago, and that's a good development. And there's no looking at likely demographic outcomes over the course of the next few decades that would point to a dramatic uptick in religiosity, even in the developing world, because the developing world is becoming more politically and economically stable, and that's something that tends to fall by the wayside as that happens. But we still have to be vigilant, and I thank these panelists for their vigilance.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, everybody. And yes, so Chase, you were saying something. Power corrupts?
Yep.
Did you have any more to expand on the power notion of religion?
Or whatever you like.
Yeah, it's like people who are inclined to do major mischief will basically manipulate people's religious beliefs to get them to go along.
And do you think?
I mean,
where do you think? What do you think the benefit of going along is? If the immortality of the soul, as I said, if the immortality of the soul is at stake, so somebody's eternal life is at stake, wouldn't it be immoral for the religious person not to act?
Well, and that brings up such a great point.
These are weasel concepts. Neither immortality nor the soul is a very discrete concept.
Right.
Well, but these are enshrined in religious constitutions.
What's that?
These are enshrined in religious constitutions. This is what it's all about. After you die, your soul, something happens. You can go across time. You either get punished or you get rewarded, or they don't know what to do to you. They throw you in a purgatory type state. This sort of stasis. Immortality of the soul seems to be some sort of central concept to explain away life. And people do terrible things in order to liberate people from what they perceived are bad ideas. If I'm a Muslim and you're a Christian, I want to make sure you're a Muslim so that you don't get punished in a bad way. It's actually an act of love.
There's nothing terribly altruistic in that. It is that kind of blunt instrument that Mr. Holling referred to, and I referenced thereafter. It's just a manipulation. The idea that they're doing a service to people is an afterthought that they use to rationalize it.
Mr. Holling?
Well, I contend that that very few people are actually believe the doctrine that they say that they follow, and it's because of that. So, in other words, if you really truly believed that if I didn't do X, Y, and Z, that I would literally spend an eternity suffering, and you were my friend or family member or just a stranger who cared, you would do anything to prevent that. And you don't see that except for in the very most ardent followers. and we criticize those followers. But I have to say that the Muslim who blows themselves up, at least, I mean, it's a horrible, horrible thing. I'm not trying to make anything positive about it, but I have to say that they are one of the only groups who are doing what they say they believe in. So it's that whole thing about the eternal soul and everything. I don't think that most people, if you really press them, they might not admit it, but they don't really believe that. I don't think that it's
so. Wouldn't that, by that logic, then make all other religious institution that had this sort of doctrine futile? I mean, all this religious effort to infiltrate the schools or to change the constitution or to manipulate the state, because if you don't have a one-to-one degree relationship with the laws, and it's only the most, because this is the thing, it's only really the most aggressive, sophisticated religions that survive. We talk about Christians or Muslims or Buddhists or Baha'i or Judaism, or it's only the religions that have some sort of continuity and that can crush others and have this mind virus that can actually live and survive. There are so many religions that are gone from the face of the earth, thousands and thousands and thousands that we don't talk about because they just don't have that staying power of these other mega religions. Wouldn't the half-heartedness of some of these mega religions that you see today mean that that their evangelism is futile because they're not literally extremists? Anybody can answer this.
I think that their purpose
It's
is
counterproductive.
different from what they say it is. So I don't think that they're not focused. I think they're focused on control, and I think they're focused on raising as much money as they can and manipulating the political system as much as they can. So they have a purpose.
Yeah.
I just
like Joel Osteen, Pat Robertson, and them.
Yeah, are you saying that these guys are Trojan horses for more extreme elements in the future? Is that what they're trying to achieve? Because you'd have to move over on that spectrum, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's not. It's a Trojan horse containing just a bunch of rabid weasels. The theocracy is not a terribly nice place to live. What the things that they're aspiring to are not ordered, wonderful things that they imagine them to be. So, I mean, that's reflected in the concerns that you both described, moments ago. That are they really doing the thing that they want to do? The answer is, of course not. Religious. Why do religious conservatives in the United States and the world around speak in fearful tones about secularism? There's a need for some kind of ignorance and some kind of disordered thinking to even engage with this sort of thing, and that ignorance and disordered thinking is not a real great ingredient to building an ordered civil society.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. So we'll go to you, Mr. Chase. Chase, what do you think about religion and the education system? Do you think religion should have influence in the education system?
No, especially not in areas like science or history.
And what about homeschooling, for example? How do you get rid of how do you resolve the issue of homeschooling and religiosity in education?
I think scrap all the religious-based homeschooling crap, and insist that the kids learn all angles, all viewpoints, and then let them make up their own minds.
Mr. Holling, what do you think about the education system and religiosity? Do you think education systems should be influenced by religion?
No, certainly not. And I don't know that I would bring the argument directly to separation of church and state. I understand that that's a big piece of it, and I think that that's important. But let's talk about the just the fact that it's ridiculous. I mean, I don't want them teaching my child the flat Earth philosophy. I don't want them teaching them about, leprechauns and fairies. I don't, so it's not, and it doesn't have to do with, the separation of church and state as much as it does just quality education. I want them, my kids to learn what they need to know, when they get out of school and just to be smart, productive members of society. And, and it's none of that fake stuff. It's none of that, it just doesn't make any sense to teach that in school. As far as the homeschool piece, though, I have to say, I don't know that I don't know. I mean, I think if somebody wants to pull their kids out of school and teach them religion, I think they're that I don't think it's a smart thing to do. I certainly wouldn't, obviously I wouldn't do it. I would discourage it greatly, but I don't know that there should be a law against it, because that seems like it's in their own home and they can teach them, if they want to teach them about unicorns and fairies, that's kind of stupid, but, I don't know that we can legislate something like that.
And I'll ask you, in addition, what do you think about consumer choice? So private schooling. If you want to send if you want to pay for your child to be educated, plus have theology training through the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church or whatever your local church is that acceptable? That's consumer choice, yeah, or no?
I think that as long as they're not receiving any government funds, then yeah, I don't see. Again, I don't agree with it. I don't think that it's the smart move for parents by any means, but I don't know that I would legislate it out of existence. As long as the government isn't funding it.
So a privately regulated, a privately funded school that isn't reliant on state funding, yeah.
Privately funded and overseen by the government to the extent that they're teaching the core curriculum, at least, so that we know that in addition to all this crap that they're teaching, they are at least getting the basics.
Ben Zion, education. Do you think that religion should have an influence on education, homeschooling, and/or public schooling as well? You can add on to these.
Yeah, no, not if you want to have a more stable society. I assume that people living well is mostly what they want. And these kinds of institutions are going to backfire. In the 70s, when people like Phyllis Schlafly started coming along, in the 80s, we started to see this resurgence in a very a more canny kind of religious right, a more organized and politicized religious right that was mobilized in particular ways. That was also the time when people started homeschooling a little bit more again. But there was never a time when they had no educational standards that they were required to fulfill. They maybe weren't terribly well enforced, but they were still required to teach basic subjects and meet certain benchmarks in that homeschooling education. But I think that landscape has improved in recent years. An awful lot more of the people who are percentage-wise who are homeschooling are homeschooling because they feel that the sort of e-learning modules and things of this kind are of use to them, and maybe they feel that perhaps rightly so, that the public institutions, particularly in some locales, are kind of brutal, and those are legitimate criticisms. So it's hard to want to discourage people from doing that. As a techno-futurist, it's very hard for me to look askance at any of that, because I'm inclined to think that things like telepresence and a more enhanced version of that, of those basic e-learning portals that we see now, in time might wholly negate the need for this pretty substantial chunk of the tax base that's being spent on public education, or largely mediated. I don't want to see that done too hastily or to the harm of workers. But I do think that it is something to look forward to.
Chase, do you believe that secular education and secular society is better for humanity? And if yes, why?
Absolutely better. No, secular. No, it's like there's no. I mean, face it. I mean, that Abrahamic God is a major dick, and these people, Muslims, Christians, Jews, want to follow him, and then they fight each other over which interpretation of which version of which sacred text is the correct one.
And why is secular society a resolution to some of these ills?
There'll be one less thing to fight over.
That's good. Mr. Holling, is secular society and secular education better for society as a whole? And if so, why?
Sure. I mean, it goes back again to the fact that it's true. That it's real. That it's based on science. And I think that Dawkins says that a society based on Darwinism wouldn't be a great thing if it was always a survival of the fittest, and you were just trying to step on whoever you can to get to where you need to be. So to that extreme, a society run by science, I understand, doesn't make sense, but I think that the where religion belongs is in a philosophical discussion, and it's fine there to talk about it, as a philosophy, but when you start to talk about it as fact, and you start to talk about it in scientific terms, that's where I disagree, and where it really becomes a problem, and where you start to say that other people need to believe what you believe, and that's where the wars come from, is really just saying that you have to be like us and believe what we believe, or we're going to kill you. Literally, that's really what that comes down to. So
how do you think?
Obviously,
we had an anthropologist on last episode. He would have been really good to have on right now to ask this question too. But how do you think? What type of survival mechanism is religion for humans? Why do you think we invented myths and stories and these legends and passed down these sacred texts, as Mr. Chase alluded to? Why did we invent that as an evolutionary concept?
Sure. I think if you go back to, if you picture a small tribe of people and there's a thunderstorm, there's no possible way that they're going to deduce exactly why that's happening. Why is the lightning happening? Why is the thunder happening? Why does it rain today and not tomorrow? That sort of thing. And by our nature, we want answers to these questions. And now, what's funny is that there are people who are still saying, okay, I don't have an answer to that question, so it's got to be a God. It's got to be something larger than myself. It's got to be, And back then, that made sense, because that's really all they had. They didn't, have the means to really figure it out, and so that made some sense. There's got to be somebody up there who's pissed off, and that's why there's thunder, or whatever. Nowadays, we can say, okay, I don't understand why this is happening, but let me investigate and find out why. And we should be able to get a little more sophisticated than, well, it's got to be a magic man in the clouds doing it. So.
Yeah, and that works right back to the rational deduction of the beginning of the universe, because we can get to within a fractions, a hair of just after the universe starts with the Big Bang. We can scientifically deduce that, but then we can never quite know. There's the Big Bounce theory, there's God, there's this, there's that. There's a lot of theories of what could have happened before, but there's a big black hole there as to what actually happened, and that sort of stumps science. But even one day, with supercomputers and super mathematical calculations, we might even work that out. We might even crack the code, the God code, the theory of everything and everything like that. It's time, it's rationality, it's science, it's investigation. Even the toughest problems can be solved, and even if they don't get solved, maybe it's something that we never know. It's all hypothesis. I find, if you, like you mentioned rightly, the gods were very specific. Neptune was the god of the oceans. And there's an ocean. Well, he must be the god of that one. And Pegasus flew too close to the sun, and Zeus did lightning, and they're all specific to interactions with nature, and it's quite easy to deduce that. But then Yahweh, it's all these Abrahamic gods, as Mr. Chase alluded to, it's more encompassing. As the world gets more complicated, it's just more encompassing, and you can just answer it for more. Instead of having to remember all the different gods for all the different things, you can just deduce it down to this singularity god who's the master of all mechanics. Ben, is secular society a good thing or a bad thing? And what about in education?
Yes.
Education.
Please go on, Andrew.
Yeah. Secularism in education. Yeah, I mean, children should be taught facts, not basically fairy tales written by plagiarized off from earlier religions, originally written by people who didn't know where the sun went at night.
Yeah, I actually want to piggyback on that fairy tale notion, and also a little bit on what Mr. Holling was saying. This kind of discussion need not necessarily be some sort of culture war line in the sand. It should be focused on just better outcomes. So any kind of preoccupation with something that's not terribly sensible, numerology or astrology, or the idea that little green men are coming to Earth and visiting me, like those things are not ideas that preoccupy entire continents, so they're not so controversial, say, as criticizing religious worldview. But they're equally confused and silly, these are things that are confused and silly are not things that should be a part of education. They're not things that should really be a part of public policy. Certainly, public education sort of falls in between there. So yeah, I don't. We said this once, I think, on this program and on the last program, that there's it's not likely that we're going to see a huge preponderance of religious literalists causing geopolitical tensions in the way that they have in the last century and parts of this century. So maybe we can afford to sort of be magnanimous about some of this and just try to get along with our religious moderate brothers, encourage them to be a little more critical and think a little more critically about these fundamentalists and what they're doing. But certainly in the United States is the wealthiest country in the world, and it's also a country that in certain particulars is not is verging on being a third world country, so to speak, and that is owing to this tendency since the Phyllis Schlaflys of the world started to have an influence on public policy and the ordering of institutions, and we need to, particularly on this continent, find ways to reverse these trends and wrest power from these institutions. There's only some 20 million religious arch conservatives in this country, but they basically are the ruling party because of these tendencies of entities like the Koch network and people like Newt Gingrich or Mitch McConnell today. These people who have gelded our democracy in service to this sham religious corporatism now reigns supreme, and it's that very thing that is why we have $15 trillion GDP and 55% of people living paycheck to paycheck. It's an odd paradox, and it's not wholly owing to religious people per se, but it's a big part of that equation.
Chase, something that Richard Dawkins said, he says, I am against religion because it teaches us to be satisfied with not understanding the world. What do you say to that quote?
Satisfied with not understanding the world. That kind of thinking is dangerous. You know, we cannot afford to be willingly ignorant of the world around us. I mean, where would we be if we didn't keep trying to expand our knowledge? Probably still living in caves.
Do you think, Mr. Chase, that that religion has a Darwinistic complex in it? Do you think it's evolved to help humanity survive?
No. No, as a general rule, no.
Okay. Fantastic. All right. So I am against religion because it teaches us to be satisfied with not understanding the world. Mr. Holling, what do you say to Richard Dawkins?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly why one of the big reasons I'm against religion, and it goes right back to what I was saying before about, I don't know the answer, so it must be God. That's sort of the lazy way of coming to a conclusion, and it doesn't progress us. There's nothing that religion doesn't progress. Nothing's been invented because of religion. Nothing's been discovered scientifically by religion, because it's stagnant, and that's not where we want to be. We want to keep progressing, and so yeah, religion doesn't support that.
What about when Islam went through a golden era, a golden age, and it helped perpetuate science? Do you incorporate that into your calculations?
It's a good point, but I don't know that it was Islam as much as specific people who happened to be Muslim. So I don't know that it was the religion itself that caused any of that as much as certain people who happen to be part of that religion.
What about?
Yeah, I'll say, I'd like to comment on that, but not on Islam specifically, but on it's a little bit like trying to get some useful information about 21st century cyber wars by thinking about military history of ancient Rome or something. I'm sure there's something of interest there that's relevant to gaming out cyber wars today, but not quite as much as you might suppose. It was a different world, the pre-literate world, the world before universal literacy of the last 200 years, and just as we were saying that those proto-nationalistic entities in the form of these religious empires might have served as some organizing principle then. That doesn't mean that organizing principle is all that useful now in a networked world and a post-industrial world and so forth. It's really apples to oranges. So to say, oh, this great philosopher contributed so much to advancing scientism in his day, well, if he was here now, it wouldn't be all that great.
What about the argument, Mr. Holling? What about the argument that secularist society is dangerous to humanity? I mean, the secular society and secular rational and reason has brought about things like atomic weapons, which could end humanity, and they've blown up lots of them and caused radiation around the world. And what do you say to that? Does secular society bring its own dangers?
So you're lumping secular society in with science, and although most scientists are secular, they don't do things in the name of secular society. And so the atomic bomb was developed, by scientists, and whether or not they were secular doesn't really. That's not why they developed it. So I think that you can look at almost any statistic, divorces, child abuse, crime, anything, any of those sorts of societal ills that none of us like to to think about. And across the board, people who identify as secular tend to participate in those things less. So in other words, like atheists have like a 3% or something, some ridiculously low divorce rate, whereas Christians have, it's around 47% or something like that. So, so I don't buy that secularism in itself does anything. I mean, to me, secularism is just you don't believe in religion. So people don't really do things in the name of secularism.
Why do you think there is a divergence? Why do you think secular people have these lower divorce rates and have these sorts of traits as opposed to religious people, especially in the modern context? Historically, that's harder to pan out. But in the modern context, what's going on there? Do you have any ideas?
I don't know.
Is it the sample size?
I mean, I'm sure that plays a part, but the numbers are so. I mean, there's such a huge gap in the numbers that I don't think that's enough to account for it. The snarky person in me wants to say it has something to do with intelligence, and I don't want to say that anyone who's religious isn't intelligent, because there are many, very very intelligent religious people. But I think that if you look at the demographics of people who identify as religious, they tend to be less educated in most studies. I think that might be part of it. They tend to have a lower income in general. So there are some of those things that they're not. I'm not saying that being less educated or having a lower income is because they're religious, but those happen to coincide. And so I think that, that's, I don't know because I haven't done the studies, but that would be my guess as to why.
There's a lot of variables, and one thing that I was thinking about is maybe the fact that they put less of a premium on this religious people put less of a premium on this existence, so there's not as much invested into it, whereas secular people are running the more Darwinistic route, where they're ingesting more information, traveling more, they're investing for the long run ideas, and therefore taking things a little bit more seriously while they're in this life. It's a question of morals and your outlook upon life and how you approach it. And there's an interesting statistic. I was reading it on the way here to the office this morning. The worldwide collapse in trust of institutions. We're at an all-time low. And it's basically formulated from two different things, one being wealth inequality and the other religion. So religious people are at an all-time low of trust of institutions, because they're all starting to look at the breakup of the world and the things going wrong, and they blame secularism and constitutions that weren't writ by God, etc. And they're saying, that it's these institutions that have brought about the calamities, and the wealth is the other one, where poor people are blaming rich people. And there's a collapse there where undereducated people and lower incomes are now looking at institutions and saying, no, we don't trust them. There's a huge trust collapse gap, a collapse gap, a trust gap, where richer people trust institutions, poorer people don't. Religious people don't trust institutions, secular people do. What do you say to that, Mr. Holling?
So I assume when you say institutions, you're not talking about religious institutions, though.
No, I'm talking about just global institutions that have been, United Nations or your local, your banks or government, municipal governments. People are seeing a lot of problems around the world, and they're blaming these type of governmental, private institutions for a lot of the ills, and there's a trust gap.
Sure, and it makes sense. I mean, there is a tremendous wealth inequality, around the world, but especially in the U.S. And and at the same time, you have, if you look at the debates, the Democratic debate, the billionaires or the billionaire class corporations, that sort of thing, are being blamed for that. Not that they shouldn't be, but I think that's becoming more and more prevalent in the news, and anywhere you look where people are noticing, I think more. Well, I think it's bigger now too, so it's easier to notice. But I think that people are noticing those disparities more, and and who else are you going to pin it on other than the people who have what you don't have?
Yeah, and the religious people are saying the same thing, that there's not enough influence of their religion in those institutions, and therefore there's a trust gap there. Ben, what do you say about the trust gap emerging between religious and economic people against these institutions?
Well, to some degree, this is people engaging in a kind of mindless alarmism, and some of that is basically socially engineered. I mean, Brexit is going through very soon, but Brexit did not come about organically. Brexit was a kind of brainchild of outside agitators in the form of folks like Steve Bannon, and of course a lot of other people in the UK as well. But that this is something that's a lot of these sentiments are being seeded by the Cambridge Analyticas of the world, and promoted by little troll farms in Macedonia and here and there, and all kinds of stuff like that. This is a very real part of our world. This is a very real part of these kind of anti-establishment sentiments, particularly the stupider ones. And if you look at the year that we are in, 2020, and compare it to 2010, the world is wealthier, and the same is true of the previous decade, and so forth. From the beginning of the network era until now, global gross world product has gone on up fourfold, and on the African continent, which is still quite poor by comparison, but that number has gone up fivefold. And you see a commensurate reduction in the number of people who have not food nor potable water. There's people are down into the hundreds of millions as opposed to the billion plus of that time. So the world is not actually getting worse. It's becoming more politically stable and affluent. And some of this is, I would, in a word, chalk it up to growing pains of living in that networked world, and figuring out how to live in that networked world, and also substantive paradigm shifts of the kind that we would be talking about if we're talking about shifting, for example, to a fully post-industrial or full automation society, or more highly digitalized society. All of those things, there's going to be a transition there, and then some of that transition is going to be a little confusing and frightening.
Absolutely. Well, I've got to leave it there, ladies. Everybody, I've got to leave it there. But look, Chase, thank you so much for coming on. Is there anything you wanted to say before we left?
So you guys have this like every week, or?
Yeah, you're invited on. If you want to come back. You can check out the channel.
Yeah, Steele's doing a bunch of shows every week.
Thank you.
Cool.
Cool. Thank you, Mr. Holling. Thank you so much for coming on Detonation. Is there anything you wanted to say in summary?
That's right.
No, just thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on, and yeah, I'll follow you from now on. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you so much. Yeah, we just got to cut it short because I've got to run to work. Mr. Zion, thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, anything
Thanks
you wanted
again,
to say in summary?
2020.com, transhumanist-party.org/membership, and stay tuned for our Free and Equal Election Foundation televised debate with myself and other presidential candidates on March 4th, coming to you live from the Chicago Hilton. Be there if you can. And thanks again, folks, for listening and thinking about these ideas.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Make sure you hit the subscribe and the bell so you can jump in live. And thanks to Thrivous as well. We've got a new sponsor, Thrivous. I'll leave that in the comments probably tomorrow. I've run out of time now, but thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, and happy 2020 and the start of a new decade. And I hope this decade is better than the last.
Live long and prosper.
All right,
Cheers
that's
to that.
Detonation. We're busy putting death out of business. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
All right, thanks, guys.